Thank you, Professor Bora and Professor Punekar, for hosting me. I've been coming to Guwahati for a number of years, but I've never had the chance to come to your campus. A phenomenal place as I see it, and of course, a brand that India is proud of all over the world. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you about what we call sustainable development. In the context of the world today, we brush through North Americas, the Europes, the Africa, South Asia, and so on. Talk a little bit about India in particular, because that would be of most interest. But then I'd like you to ask me questions. I don't want this to be just a one-way conversation. So think through while I'm speaking and shoot as many as you can when I'm done. So essentially, globalization as we know it and as it has panned out over the last 45, 50 years is essentially a mix of policies that would say go for free markets, lower your trade barriers, open up trade, foreign investment, the standard, what came to be called as the Washington Consensus back in the late 70s, early 80s. And Washington Consensus essentially was a term that was put together by a British economist by the name of John Williamson at the Institute for International Economics at Washington, D.C. It was made up of about 10 different features of free market economics, largely a consensus between the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. Treasury, and a lot of think tanks that were based in Washington, and hence the term Washington Consensus. And so both the World Bank and the IMF, among others, were pushing developing countries to adopt more and more of these policies, saying that at least the World Bank would argue that our projects are not giving the best returns because your policies are not right. You need to first fix your policies. And so started what were called the structural adjustment loans in the early 80s from the World Bank, because the World Bank was essentially a project funding agency for the developing world. The policy reform arena was essentially in the IMF's domain, but largely linked to balance of payments problems. But there was a time from early 80 onwards that the World Bank and the IMF both were involved with what is called policy reform in developing countries. And so over time, if you look at, let's say, from the 60s of the 20th century onwards, countries were actually delivering on the growth front, if not everything else. So in the 60s, it was Japan, which was able to double its per capita income, grow at rates that would allow for the per capita income to be doubled over time. In the 70s, it was South Korea, which was able to double its per capita income. In the 80s and the 90s, it was China, which was able to do it. But primarily, the set of underlying policies were along the lines of what is called Washington Consensus. And then came India. And I want to quickly touch upon a couple of our papers that we did. First in the year 2000, to talk about a similar goal for India to be achieved in the first decade of the 21st century, meaning from the year 2000 to 2010. And the idea essentially was that India could also double its per capita income, provided it was doing some of the things right, which it was not doing in the late 90s, and that a goal of that sort could be a national push for the government of India as well as the state governments to allow for increases in the standards of living of its masses. So with the access and privilege to have the Prime Minister's ear, I went to him in January of 2000 suggesting a couple of goals which were out of a paper that my colleague and my boss, Jeffrey Sachs, and I wrote, which was called India's Decade of Development. And the idea was essentially the following, that here was a time that the first decade of the 21st century was putting in place all that was required, largely all that was required for that decade to become a major decade of development. So you would have major investments in public health, in education, in drinking water, in roads, in ports, in telecom, all of that which was not happened post-independence since 1947. And along with it, you would need at least a couple of very critical goals to be set for the country as a whole. And so the two goals that I went to him with in January of 2000 were the following. Number one, we will try to attain doubling of per capita income over 10 years in real terms. So if in the year 2000 the per capita income was X, we will try and get it to become 2X in real terms, which means minus inflation, by 2010. So this was a national goal. It would put hopefully the states behind it to rally behind something like this and try and attain that goal along with raising the ambitions of the Indian people. Because it was also my sense at that time that India was not ambitious enough. We were not setting targets which were good enough for us. We were setting the bar relatively low. And so the goal had several objectives behind it. And of course, the second goal related to literacy, because India was to a great extent considered illiterate, because 55% of India was illiterate in the year 2000. So the goal was, can we try and attain universal primary literacy in 10 years by the year 2010? Basically, the premise was somewhat different from Washington Consensus because we were not talking about large-scale financial liberalization. We were not talking about rupee convertibility on the capital account. We were not talking about those things. But we were talking about setting a high growth rate as a target, getting, of course, more foreign investment, trade as an engine of economic growth were certainly some of the objectives behind that paper, which was called India's Decade of Development. Now, the reason I talk to you about this paper is because I'm contrasting this to a paper that was written in the year 2012, a sequel to this paper, and that is called India's Decade of Development, looking back at the last 10 years and looking forward to the next 20. So the idea was to assess our own paper that was written in the year 2000 to see if at all anything from that paper was met, and if so, what, and if not, why, and going forward for the next 20 years, what is it that we need to do in a changed world order and a changed world environment completely. So the second paper essentially moved on from the sets of issues that we looked at in the year 2002, what we started to call a triple bottom line. Earlier it was a single bottom line about growth, that you had to grow at higher rates of growth than what you had in the past. But in 2012, the globalization as we knew it had changed in our own thinking from pure and simple globalization and its own characteristics to what we call sustainable development. And in sustainable development, there is a triple bottom line. Number one, of course, is growth. Nobody denies that you need to grow at higher rates. Number two is what is called inclusion/equity. After all, who are you growing for? Is everybody getting a fair share, or if not, at least a fair share, some share of that increased national pie? And the third is environmental sustainability, because you can't just have strategies of growth which will destroy the environment going forward. So these are the two papers. That's why I'm describing them in a little detail to say why and how our thinking changed from the year 2000 to 2012. And then in 2012, we have to look at much more than what we were looking at in the year 2000. And whether it is India or any part of the world, the concept is the same. So we strongly believe that the new globalization is actually sustainable development. And you would be surprised that the country that needs it most is the US. Because US, first of all, has least discussions on what is sustainable development. If at all there is some on university campuses, there is some in some major corporates, there is none in the US media, there is absolutely none in the Republican Party, and you're not going to expect that, or it's going to come in the years to come, because that's not something that they believe in. So, but in the meantime, US is also facing music for what it, along with Western Europe, did in the last 40, 50 years. So you have huge and serious intensity hurricanes hitting the US. You have sea level rise. You have obviously temperature rise. You have all kinds of tornadoes with big intensity. You have wildfires, which are much more frequent now because of higher temperatures. And so the US needs it most, and this is one area where it can learn a lot from the developing world. But for the most part, the other countries are quite engaged in what is called sustainable development. Europe, quite a bit. South Asia, not enough, but needs to, but does realize, India especially, that we have a lot of stakes here. Whether it is your rainfall levels or your food security, it's important that we have some measures put in place globally whereby we can deal with this global problem. This is not an India problem, this is a global problem, and it will require a global solution. But India needs to take a lead in this in terms of talking to the G8 countries to say, while you are primarily responsible for this crisis, obviously we understand that unless a global solution is found, this crisis is not going to go away, but we are not going to pay for this crisis. It's not something that we have resources for. I'd rather spend on my clinics and drinking water and roads than to spend money on clean coal technologies or anything else. So India has a role, it's a very critical role, and we need to play it strategically. And I am happy to say that this Prime Minister is quite aware of what this is and what stakes are involved and how he should deal with it. Now, these are negotiations at the global level which will require strategic thinking and constant updation of what's happening around the world. So primarily, the new globalization is the sustainable development idea. And it's, as I said, as far as India is concerned, it's critical so much from a food security point of view. For example, you have unseasonal rains now happening in February, March, April, months that they're not supposed to rain. And when you have standing crops that are getting destroyed, it's a disaster for farmers, and especially smallholder farmers who have an acre or 2 acres of land and borrow a lot to till that land and buy the seeds and fertilizers and so on. And at the end of it, the last thing you want is their crops to be destroyed. So that's a sign of climate change. That's a symptom. You have rainfall levels which are not adequate during the monsoon times in different parts of India. And that's critical because 2/3 of Indian agriculture is still dependent on monsoon rains. And then you have, of course, situations where you have too much water, so which is called a flood, and that's destroying things. So, and then you have situations like you had in Mumbai a few years back when so much of rain fell in like 3 hours that the city just could not cope up with the amount of rain that fell. So all of these and unseasonal rains have become an annual feature now, which destroys smallholder farmers very seriously. So it's critical not just to think about how a country is going to grow at 8.5% or 9%, but how are you going to grow at the same time in a manner that is environmentally sustainable and socially just? These are not easy questions. These are tough. They would require serious political leadership and commitment. It would require a lot of understanding on the part of people who have the resources and are willing and able to share. It will require a lot of public investment from the government in critical areas like health and education and water and renewable energy. It will require a lot of investment in agricultural R&D, because I firmly believe that India needs a second green revolution, largely in eastern India. The western part of Punjab and Haryana and all those states are fairly done with the green revolution. Now agriculture is actually stagnating in those parts of India. But you need West Bengal and this part of India and Orissa and all of the eastern part to actually have a growth spurt when it comes to agriculture. That's not going to happen out of thin air. It will require a lot of investment in ag R&D. It will require irrigation systems. It will require a good mix of technology. It will require modern agricultural practices. And most of all, it will require a sustained political support to the agricultural sector going forward. So again, as I said, these are not easy goals, but a realization that these are important, that these are playing with the lives of hundreds and millions of people, especially young people. It's critical that our political leaders and civil servants are willing and able to learn and understand and comprehend the enormity of the challenge and think of possible solutions going forward. So that's, in a very broad sense, the idea of globalization and how it's moving towards the new globalization and what essentially the challenges are. And again, to go back, whether challenges are in India or in Africa or in Europe, they're all the same. As I mentioned, Europe is every year gets heat waves now, which it was not getting 10 years back. And it's increasing every year in terms of intensities. In Africa, you have floods, which have never been seen for decades. There's such shortage of rainfall, but you have floods. You don't have systems to deal with them. In this part of the world, you very well know how things are changing. Rainfall patterns are changing. Hydrological cycles have changed, leaving implications on food security. So environment, I don't know to what extent is there debate and discussion in this country apart from campuses. How much of media attraction does it get? Are there debates among people about what should be done? I'm not very sure, but this is something that is urgent. It will require a national movement. It's not just a policy. You and I, each one of us, has to think about how to conserve energy. I was talking to a group of students yesterday when I mentioned, when somebody asked, what can I do when it comes to something like this? These are huge questions. But believe me, each one of us can do something here. And especially because 1 billion of us exist in this country. When it adds up, it will have an impact. So for example, please conserve energy. Let's not waste or have a bulb burning if it is not required. Let's switch off the fan if it is not required. Let's take off the plug if your mobile is charged. Let it not run. Or let's conserve water, or let's conserve paper. These are things that each individual can do. And imagine if this becomes a movement in terms of savings or conservation, it will have a national impact. I've always said energy saved is energy produced. And that is critical, but we don't seem to, while we may recognize the importance of the problem and importance of conservation, but we don't practice it. How do we inculcate this in our families, in our communities, in our colleges? Is partly it's your role, just like we do on the education side when we say each one teach one. You could do the same when it comes to some of these things, and not just to other children, but also at your homes. to your friends, to all over the place, because this is basically forming a habit, nothing else. As long as you're convinced that this is important, and to form a habit. So you'll all be contributing towards sustainable development. As teachers, this is what we talk about to all people, irrespective of age groups, because this is a global need of the hour in terms of conservation.